From KUOW in Seattle, welcome to Soundside. I'm Libby Dankman. And today, we're focusing the show on one interview, so let's get right to it. 2025 has been a busy year for Danni Askini. As executive director of the Gender Justice League, Askini is involved in multiple lawsuits fighting Trump administration policies related to trans rights. She's also the co-chair of the Washington Families for Freedom Coalition, created this year to fight potential state ballot measures that could impact trans youth. And by the way, she is the executive director of Trans Pride Seattle, which just hosted its annual celebration at Seattle's Volunteer Park over the weekend.
I feel like this year people wanted to be in community, and that's why Trans Pride is so special to me, because it is such an amazing opportunity to just be with each other. And so I feel like the vibe was really good, and I felt like the solidarity was there too. I get a little choked up about it.
Danni Askini and fellow trans rights activists are confronting a rapidly shifting landscape. President Trump's executive orders banning trans people in the military, targeting funding for hospitals that provide gender-affirming care for minors, and declaring the U.S. only recognizes two immutable biological sexes, as well as Supreme Court decisions, including last week's ruling that effectively upholds bans on trans health care for minors in 27 states. And has opened the door to reconsidering states' rights to ban Medicaid from covering gender-affirming care for adults. Day by day, trans rights are changing and eroding in ways that is hard for even plugged-in advocates to keep track of. Danni Askini and I sat down on Monday afternoon to talk about it all.
I feel like it's been controlled chaos. I feel like we had a plan coming into this year, some of which we had known last year after the election. And some of it has been very reactionary and felt very chaotic. But overall, I feel like the community is together and we're standing strong. And I really have seen a much stronger show of support, even as we see incredibly oppressive policies that are attacking every part of trans people's lives. I feel like people understand the stakes in a much more real way, both trans people and non-trans people. And I feel like there's been an incredible amount of support from the community, support from elected leaders in Washington state, support from our Attorney General's office, but most of all, the community has really been together. And I think that that's incredible.
And frankly, my conversation with Danni went far longer and more wide-ranging than I expected. We talked for more than an hour, and we've tried to preserve most of that conversation here within the limits of our show clock. First up, Askini's group, Washington Families for Freedom, is gearing up for some initiative fights, possibly in 2026. Brian Haywood's group, Let's Go Washington, which was behind the state ballot measures in 2024's election cycle, targeting the Climate Commitment Act and the state's capital gains tax, among other policies. Let's Go Washington is back. Haywood has filed several initiatives, but hasn't started signature gathering yet. Askini says she's trying to get in front of two major battles likely on the horizon. The first is over Haywood's push to restore parts of the so-called Parents' Bill of Rights, which Democrats in the legislature overhauled last session. The changes, especially restricting parents' access to medical records, those were hotly contested by Republicans. Democrats said this was done to comply with state and federal law. Askini argues the Parents' Bill of Rights infringed on the rights of young people.
There are rights that young people need to have. You know, I grew up in foster care. I'm a child sexual abuse survivor. I've been very public about this. And for me, having safe adults who weren't in my household that I could trust and build a rapport with, that meant getting to safety. And anything that happens that infringes or curbs that ability of young people who might be experiencing harm from having other trusted adults they can tell is very concerning.
Danni Askini is concerned about another major ballot measure campaign that is probably coming in 2026. Brian Haywood has filed a couple versions of an initiative to ban trans girls from participating in K-12 sports in Washington. Askini says these proposals would change long-term policy governing youth sports in our state. And this topic led us into a larger conversation about the nationwide, highly politicized attention on trans athletes and what's behind it.
I think it's important for listeners to know, we've had the oldest policy in the United States to protect trans young people in schools to be able to play consistent with their friends and their gender identity. on teams, it hasn't really been an issue. People point to one trans girl winning one track event at one track meet, and it's like any trans success is like abhorrent, and our society cannot tolerate trans people winning ever. That's how I interpret it as a trans person, as a trans woman. It's really shocking to me that one trans person winning a single event is so appalling to so many people. It says a lot about how far we have to go. I think for us, when we think about this, we're talking about 5 to 20 student athletes out of 250,000 student athletes across the whole state, according to the WIAA, which is the Washington Interscholastic Athletic Association. And, to focus the entirety of a whole ballot measure, to have everybody in the state vote on whether those 5 students, those, 5 young people, some of those young people might be in grade school or middle school. And the differences between, 8-year-olds is not huge. Playing kickball, I don't think that that's, a super big concern. And there are some legitimate concerns in this area, and I don't want to minimize people's concerns broadly. That's not who I am as a person, as somebody who's worked in policy. But I think those concerns can be addressed on a local level, on a case-by-case basis, between, school athletic directors, between parents and student athletes. It doesn't require passing a state law that categorically excludes a whole group of people and sends a broader message to every trans person in this state that we should be excluded from portions of our society. And we have a very troubled history in this culture of banning whole groups of people from parts of our society. And I think that it's the wedge that leads into a lot of other bans coming forward.
I want to get to the idea of this as a wedge issue because I think you're also seeing some different fault lines along what's typically, seen as partisanship on the right and the left. There are some interesting, people coming forward and having, different opinions on trans girls in sports and trans women in sports. Gavin Newsom comes to mind saying, I think that trans girls in girls' sports is unfair. Do you think that people can have legitimate questions about sports and trans girls' place in it without maybe going straight to, we need to ban this and this is the only way to do it? Like, is there a nuanced conversation to be had here?
Of course. I mean, I think the question is where that conversation happens and where political power lies. So trans people have less than 1% of the population. We are politically powerless. That isn't a conversation that is being dictated to by a whole population, 99% of the people, dictating to us what happens. I think one of the things that never gets discussed in this is a lot of what I experience and what other trans people experience is cis people talking to other cis people about trans people. We're not in that conversation, and that is a very different thing politically. And what happens in those conversations where two groups of people are talking about a third group of people are incredible distortions.
And that must feel I know you are very professional, pulled together, you're used to these policy circles and these conversations, but just on a personal level, that must feel very frustrating.
Yeah, it's deeply angering. It's very frustrating. And I think, people react to being oppressed in that way a lot of different ways. And people see trans folks as irrational or reactionary or over the top. And I think there's no right way to face oppression. And I'm very pulled together because I've been doing this since I was 15. I've been doing this since I was a trans young person. And I understand people's concerns, but I think where this ends up going is like, few people look at me and think I'm going to be a WNBA star, right? I am a trans woman, but I'm 5'5" and 120 pounds, and I couldn't shoot a free throw to save my life. I don't think of trans people as being particularly an athletic group of people. Just historically, that's not real. And I think there's such a deep irony of the double standard of both having been made fun of my whole childhood and youth of like not being quote unquote, masculine enough or athletic enough, to then have that turned on its head and be told like, oh, you're just transitioning to like gain some type of weird advantage. There's a lot
that
of
would be
absurdity.
Quite a long con.
Yes,
if
exactly.
This was a gender transition in order to achieve some sort of medal in a high school track event.
Yeah. And yeah, totally. And so I think I think of it as distortions that happen where it's both sides, both folks trying to defend trans people's right to exist and people who are deeply uncomfortable by the existence of trans people. Both sides are not 100% clear about what they're actually feeling and what's driving their decision making. But I think that those distortions often happen when trans people are not in that conversation. And, like nobody ever reaches out to involve us in these conversations, even though we've been doing this work forever. It's a very, there isn't an attempt on the other side to have a conversation because that's not what this is about. This is about using us as a population, as a scapegoat, to stoke fear and anger and resentment and to drive people to the polls in order to win, other stated policy goals. And I'm not dismissing people's concerns. I think, they're legitimate concerns. But I think people need to zoom out and ask, why are we talking about this one? Why are we talking about 5 to 20 kids in a state of 9 million people? And really,
you tell me, why do you think it's happening?
Yeah, I think about 10 years ago, after marriage equality, I worked on many marriage equality campaigns. I worked on non-discrimination campaigns. The far right, they struck gold. They found an issue that really triggered a lot of people, made them incredibly uncomfortable. People's discomfort drives a strong emotional engagement. Even Trump has said this, where it riles people up. People react very strongly. They feel a sense of disgust, and that disgust drives them to make political decisions. And I think to have lived as long as I have, I'm young. I'm only 42, but I think that's kind of younger. But
we're almost the same age. You're very young.
Yeah, thank you.
You're a baby.
Yeah, but I transitioned in the 90s, and I was a young person in the 90s. And there's all this idea that trans young people will change their mind, or it's a new thing, and suddenly there's more trans people. It's no, we were here. We just didn't have access. We didn't have role models. As freedom grows, more people come out, more trans people transition. It's a normal thing. And I think it's a positive sign of a freer society that people feel safer. But I think the right struck gold many years ago, and they have just mined that vein forever. It was about bathrooms and locker rooms. I don't know if folks remember, we had 2 ballot measure attempts in 2016 and 17. I helped fight those, right? And then suddenly, 2018, stopped hearing about it. Suddenly it was not a big deal, right? And then we moved on to the next issue. Now it's, trans youth in sports. It's they find, even within the trans community, young people can't even vote, right? They find the most edge cases to hone in on. And then every trans person who wins any obscure sport, they will just send straight to Fox News, and it's all you'll hear about for 3 days. And they really whip themselves into a frenzy. But I think that that's kind of the dynamic that happens, and I wish the left did the same sometimes. We don't seem to have that same sort of drive to, take those cases and just blow them up. But yeah, it's going to be a rough fight, and we've tried to avoid this. I feel like we've done everything we can to educate the public. I don't want to subject young people, trans young people, who have an immensely high suicide rate. I don't want to subject them to a statewide ballot measure campaign. I would do anything I can. And if Brian Haywood is listening, give me a call. We'll hash it out. We'll go have coffee. I'm an eminently reasonable human being. And I know what it was like. I came out in a statewide non-discrimination ballot measure campaign. I lost friends. I get choked up thinking about it. I lost friends in 1998. I know what... Because
of a public stance that you took because of being out there.
Yeah. And we had a statewide ballot measure campaign for non-discrimination in the state of Maine, which is where I grew up. And, we lost that measure, and it was devastating. It was an open call to every bully in the state to bully LGBT young people. And... I know what statewide ballot measure campaigns do to young people, and I think if Brian Haywood is as Christian as he says he is, he would look deep in his heart and consider whether he wants to subject young people to that kind of scrutiny and that kind of malice. And I think it's irresponsible to do that to young people, personally, as somebody who was there. So Brian Haywood, give me a call. I want the best for our young people. And I know that Brian Haywood probably does too. And I don't assume that he doesn't. I think this is the wrong way to go about it.
You know, I was sitting down with a friend, speaking of having conversations across difference, who is very conservative. And she uses words like gender ideology, things that kind of key into where she's coming from when it comes to the trans rights issue. And one of the things she talked about was she feels that something is being taken away from female athletes when a trans girl is competing with them. And, you know, she talks about the performance-enhancing nature of testosterone during puberty, if somebody goes through boy puberty. These are conversations that are really triggering for certain people, and in my opinion, have radicalized some people, especially,
Absolutely.
you know, people who maybe see things in the media and they get part of the story, but they get really upset about it. And it seems to be contributing to kind of this overall backlash that politically that we're seeing across the country towards the trans community. Are you surprised that this has become so galvanizing for a lot of people?
I'm not. I feel like you never know where the lightning rod is going to be. And I think the politics of cynicism that we live in now is always seeking that lightning rod, and they're going to strike a lightning rod at some point. I wouldn't have necessarily predicted 10 years ago that this is where we would be right now. This would be the debate that we're having. I don't think it's like often we're talking about something, but not really talking about that thing, right? We're actually talking about a lot of discomfort about trans people's existence in public, our ability to be, you know, to have demands or have civil rights asks of being respected in workplaces, of having access to jobs, of being in public schools. I think it crystallizes around something that feels like it's gone too far. I think about marriage equality. I was a part of 3 different marriage equality campaigns, Oregon, Maine, and Washington. And I don't know if folks remember, but like the right had said same-sex marriage is going to destroy straight marriages. And it's like, well, straight people are doing a good enough job at destroying their own marriages. Like, it's just not real that allowing some people access to participate in an institution damages other people's ability to participate in that institution. Trans athletes also have to train. They also have to, you're not just going to walk onto a field and suddenly be amazing. Like, I would be terrible at any sport that I tried because it's just, I'm not an athletic person, right? There's still, I think where people go with it is it brings up a lot of frustration with the stalled progress for most women in this society. I think women in particular, for them, it's like they don't feel like we're advancing. And I feel that as a woman, right? I transitioned young. I faced sexism my whole career. I have fought endlessly for all women in a very intersectional way. And
so it's almost like from a place of scarcity.
Yeah.
Some women are saying, well, we can't share this.
Yeah, we fought hard for this. Why should we have to share it with you? You should go fight for your own thing. And it's totally from, I think, a place of scarcity. And that's really tragic to me. And I understand it's like it's reasonable. There are not enough trans people to impact sports in any real way. Like, it's just not real. And the idea that one trans person winning somehow destroys or eviscerates the fairness for all girls, it's like, I was never going to be good at sports because of my stature. Like, I just come from a small family. Like, nobody is like saying it's unfair if somebody genetically is taller than me, you know, that somehow it's less fair for me. We all have physical embodiment differences. Some of us are going to advance. Michael Phelps, you know, is like an amazing swimmer, right? But I think people really hone in on this thing and aren't really exploring if their discomfort is with the existence of trans people in places where they can't ignore us. And when a trans person wins something and is on a podium, you can't ignore that. And that is what feels unfair, is because people view us as lesser. And so we should not be winning. We should not be getting Academy Awards. We should not be, you know, getting gold medals because people view being trans as being inferior, as possibly being immoral. And so why should we be celebrating the existence of these people? And I feel that. I feel that in people's faces. I see disgust in people's eyes. And as a trans person doing this work, I've worked in every state in this country almost. And I get where that visceral discomfort comes from. And I think a lot of this is about the idea of unfairness is actually a feeling of disgust that then people can't face admitting to themselves that that's what they're feeling. So then it transmutes. But we should have the right to also just exist and live our lives. And for some people, that is playing sports.
Do you think the conversation is different at the professional level or the NCAA level, where we're talking about scholarships, like money, things like that involved, where somebody might say, if a trans girl or trans woman gets a scholarship over somebody who's assigned female at birth, that is somehow an unfair situation?
It's a really good question. I think there are a lot of different ways to think about it. One, I have like this question of like, I think people have this impression that like trans women just like walk off, like get out of the bleachers one day, step onto the starting line, and then win the 400 meter at the Olympics,
which
right?
is very offensive to all of the women,
right?
All of the sports, no matter your
right?
Your gender, your gender identity.
Yeah. So it's like that's the question, right? Is like, do those athletes work hard for it? Like, are they showing up to train? Are they doing the same things everybody else is doing? Are they working for it? And I would have to say, yeah, probably. Like, just being assigned male at birth, just having testosterone at some point in your history doesn't inherently make you super, it's a very sexist idea. This idea that like the difference between the sexes is so overwhelming that women can never overcome it. That's just not real, But
at the same time, I remember being around 12 or 13 and realizing in my soccer teams that we used to be able to scrimmage with the boys and beat them.
Anymore.
And all of a sudden we couldn't.
Yeah.
And it made me so mad.
Yeah.
And so I think there's like a sense memory of that gets sometimes rises up in me when I think there is like on a broader scale, not individuals are all individuals, but on a broader scale, there are performance advantages if you have that testosterone.
If you have access to testosterone for a long period of time.
Yeah.
Sure. I don't think trans people deny that. I don't think even trans athletes would deny that. I don't deny it, of course. I think there are concerns, but again, going back to like a lot of things make up this idea of fairness, right? Like, for instance, proven fact, childhood nutrition and access to good childhood nutrition is the number one predictor of how your performance will be as an older athlete. When we're talking about the NCAA, people who grew up with lack of access to healthy foods as children are not going to have as good a shot at being in the NCAA and getting those scholarships.
And there's a lot of conversations about
right?
expensive coaching early on, the kind of training regimen. Yeah.
What school district you're in, whether you have access to after-school sports. There's a lot that goes into who gets access to those things, right? So when people narrow in on trans people in this way of just distilling it down to like, oh, you have this unfair advantage, it's like trans people have a lot against them to even get on that field. I am like shocked at like, it is hard for me to be in front of people in my job that people put themselves out there in that way and face so much hatred at these events. It's appalling to me that they do. And so I think that's the other piece, right? Is fairness can be constructed in a lot of ways. And I don't deny that, like, yeah, there's some physical advantages that some trans people will have based on when they transition, when they have access. There is also an irony to, like, denying young people access to puberty blockers and gender-affirming care to then, be like, nope, you can't have that care. And then also you have these advantages. It's like such a double standard there. But yeah, I understand where the concern comes from and, it's reasonable. But I think the conclusion that people draw, which is like ban all trans young people from all sports, is not a reasonable conclusion to like address that.
You're listening to my conversation with trans rights advocate Danni Askini. She's the executive director of the Gender Justice League and co-chair of the Washington Families for Freedom Coalition, a group that was created this year to fight potential state ballot measures that could impact trans youth in Washington. Once again, we don't know exactly when or even if for sure these ballot measures will be before voters in Washington. When I reached out to Brian Haywood's group, Let's Go Washington, they said they would have more news on their plans next month. And we'll be working on having Haywood back on the show to share his perspective as soon as he's ready to talk about next steps. I enjoyed our last conversation with Brian, and I hope he is back soon. This is Soundside on KUOW. I'm Libby Dankman. Coming up, the fight over access to trans health care for people under 18 and how Askini feels about recent criticisms of the evidentiary foundations for healthcare protocols for trans youth. We'll be right back on KUOW. Welcome back to Soundside. I'm Libby Dankman. Seattle-based trans advocate Danni Askini is my guest for the hour today. We had a wide-ranging conversation on Monday afternoon about the rapidly changing legal landscape for trans rights in the U.S. and expected Washington ballot measures from Brian Haywood aimed at banning trans girls from K-12 sports and changing access to school records for parents. Next, we dove into the Supreme Court's decision released last month to uphold Tennessee's law banning gender-affirming medical care for minors. The ruling opened the door for 26 other states to have the power to enact regulations on things like puberty-delaying medication and hormone therapy for young people. In Washington state, a 2022 law prohibits discrimination for gender-affirming treatment, and the Attorney General has sued to stop a Trump executive order aiming to stop federal funding for hospitals that provide treatment to kids. But Askini says trans people, gender-questioning kids, and their families have no faith that our state will remain a safe haven for medical care. Earlier this year, Seattle Children's Hospital canceled or indefinitely postponed planned surgeries for youth at their gender clinic.
Parents are terrified, like beyond anything I've ever seen in 27 years of doing this work. People are leaving the country. I have many, many friends who have left. They have moved to Spain, they've moved to Canada, they've moved back to Sweden. People are fleeing with their children. They're terrified.
And these are people who live in these more than half of states who are in the process of banning. And in Washington state.
And in Washington.
Even though we have enshrined in law the protection for this care.
Yeah. I think people have a sense that it's going to keep going. There's going to be a federal ban, that Democrats are not going to be able to defend their young people, that it's only going to get worse. And I think adults are terrified. I think all of us feel like a federal ban on gender-affirming care for adults is coming. I think, we're afraid of Medicaid bans, and they've attempted repeatedly in this most recent bill to ban gender-affirming care for young people and adults. That
was stripped out by the Senate parliamentarian, but there was just today, just hours before we're talking right now, a ruling where a West Virginia case was kicked back to the circuit court, basically saying that West Virginia needs to basically saying the Fourth Circuit needs to reassess whether West Virginia can block gender-affirming care for adults from being covered by Medicaid, which it has done, but the court ruled was unconstitutional. Now the Supreme Court says, well, with that Tennessee case, you need to reassess. So not just we're seeing right now court rulings that limit care for minors, but also for adults potentially coming down in West Virginia and in North Carolina.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the first I've heard of that. Thank you.
Oh, yeah. That, I just was reading about it.
And I am not surprised. I think, for most trans people in this country, it's clear to us, which is, we are moving back to a period of time in our history when trans people had to figure out outside the law, how do we care for ourselves and each other? And our community is clear, which is that you cannot outlaw our existence. And I think any other community, I liken it to, for me, and this is going to be difficult for a lot of listeners to hear. Some people might find it offensive. I view what's happening to trans people as a form of religious persecution. While people think about gender-affirming care as being medical care, I don't think of it that way. It is a religious practice. We have a deeply held belief. It is a faith that only we know and we can see. If I ask people, show me your God, people cannot show me their God, right? I can't show people my gender identity. It's something I've always known about myself. It's something I've always held deeply clear. The First Amendment guarantees us all the right to our deeply held beliefs, to live those, to practice those, and to be in those. For trans people, rather than going to church to be affirmed in our faith, we have to go see doctors, right? We have to go see medical providers to get access to the care we need to affirm the belief that we have. And that, for me, has helped me to understand in this moment of persecution that what is happening is a governmental persecution of a faith minority. All of this is about persecution of our faith, taking away our ability to practice our faith, to live our faith in public, persecuting our existence in public, taking away our ability to be who we are. And so I really want people, there's a lot of faith-based people that are listening. I want people to really think and consider, what does it mean when a government can ban people from expressing who they are in public?
Askini and I turned to a hot-button paper that Supreme Court justices cited on their way to a majority opinion upholding Tennessee's ban on gender-affirming care for minors. The Cass Review on Gender-Affirming Care for Transgender Youth, which was commissioned by the NHS in the United Kingdom after a reported significant rise in the number of youth under 18 seeking gender-affirming services. Released in 2024, the 4-year review of available scientific research on trans health care for kids said basically the science isn't definitive yet for practices like puberty blockers. Quoting the report, "The reality is that we have no good evidence on the long-term outcomes of interventions to manage gender-related distress." Pediatrician Dr. Hilary Cass did not recommend banning medical treatments for gender dysphoria. She said in interviews that her purpose was to emphasize that we need more information about which kids are the best candidates for this treatment. But her review was used to limit the availability in the UK of gender-affirming services and to change how those services are provided. I asked Danni Askini, as an advocate for access to this care, how does she approach criticisms of the science undergirding it?
So many thoughts on this subject, and I've been doing this a long time. I'm like the oldest vampire, I like to joke.
I've already said we're about the same age, so you cannot say that.
I think about this in a lot of different ways. If you ban something, how do you ever prove it's efficacious? If I ban a type of care, how do I ever prove the outcome of it? That's what these state bans do. How can we ever prove that gender-affirming care works for young people if we ban it, right? It's like saying, we don't know the efficacy. I'm also a bone marrow transplant recipient, and it's like, how would we know if bone marrow transplants worked if after the first one we banned them, right? Oh, you might die in 5 years. Well, we don't know because we banned them. So there's like that, right? I don't think this is a conversation that science can solve. There's no amount of science that's going to change people's minds. This is a political conversation. It's not about the science. The science is clear. Every major medical association has looked at this and agreed. Every doctor who has long-term clinical experience treating trans young people, they all know. The American Academy of Pediatrics, they all know. They've seen the change that happens for young people. But people don't want to hear that. They don't want to listen to that. And
there's like a difference between, I guess, what you hear from clinical settings and the experience of doctors in clinical settings, and then peer-reviewed research.
That's not right. All the peer-reviewed research supports gender-affirming care. 100% of it. The Cass study is not a peer-reviewed study. It's one doctor who looked at a bunch of stuff and then injected their opinions. And lots of different, the Yale, there was like a team at Yale of actual physicians who did an analysis of the strength of the Cass study and found that it was not scientific. It was not peer-reviewed. It was not a neutral, HHS just put together this kangaroo court of people and they published a thing. You know what? There is settled science. It was settled. It has been settled. People didn't want to accept it. And that's the reality. All of these things are like, we don't accept it, so we're going to put forward a political hit job and disregard all of the emerging science and say, nope, that's not scientific enough. And it's not actually a conversation about science. It's a conversation about whether people should be allowed to exist. It's a conversation about people's anxiety with the idea of young people having autonomy. It's a conversation about whether parents should be able to choose what treatment helps their young people. I think a lot about SSRIs, antidepressants. There's a black box warning on every SSRI in this country for young people because they actually, for a period of time, increase suicide risk. If you ask any psychiatrist, any person on the street in this country, do you think young people should be banned from having access to, Prozac, Paxil, Zoloft, escitalopram? They would be like, no, absolutely not. Like, young people need those. They're a tool to treat depression, which we know could lead to suicide. Gender-affirming care is the same type of tool. Are there risks? Absolutely. Nothing is guaranteed to any person in this life with any type of medical treatment. I was not guaranteed with a bone marrow transplant I'd be alive today, but I took that risk.
But I think the conversation about gender-affirming care when it comes to not therapy and social support for a gender transition. When it comes to puberty blockers, when it comes to hormone therapy, that people argue there is a more long-term effects on a person that then they're like, the risk is higher than with an SSRI. That would be the argument. And there is a lot of, I think you're rightly pointing out that you can't get data if you don't, provide care. But there's a lot of question about, early conversations about whether gender affirming care would reduce suicidality in young people. And now it looks like there isn't the evidence there that suicidality is reduced. Basically the science is evolving. And so is treatment getting out in front of where we know
Absolutely not.
Evidence-based modalities are? Okay.
Absolutely not. I think, again, going back to the 99%, the science is being done by cis people talking to other cis people about trans people. I'm just for me,
I was just
yeah.
I would say I was just reading an op-ed. I know it's from a couple of years ago, but one of the authors is a trans person and basically saying that they were concerned that puberty blockers were being offered on a first visit in some U.S. care settings, and that they really supported the idea of therapy along the lines of what the Dutch model is, therapy for several months before offering puberty blockers. Basically, there are some trans people who have expressed some reservations about certain ways that gender affirming care has been offered in the United States. I just want to say it's not exclusively cis people, but
sure, yeah. How to explain this double standard? The concern, so this obsession with concerns about outcomes. From my perspective, right, accessing any type of healthcare in the United States is incredibly difficult. There's no guarantees with it. I think expedience in accessing any type of care in the current atmosphere of how we receive healthcare is not done perfectly or ideally. I don't think that that's true. Cancer care is that way. And I think what ends up happening is people focus, and I just read a Washington Post article, person who did the HHS decision defending that decision, right? A lot of this focuses on the idea that being a trans person is a bad outcome, that trans people always experience regret, that growing up to be a trans person is a negative outcome. I cannot separate people's fear and their fear and anxiety that people feel from the disgust and revulsion that people feel towards trans people. It's deeply offensive for me to engage in a conversation of the care that I know saved my life. And every trans person that I've talked to has said, this saved my life. This made my life immensely better. People ignore all trans people.
Basically,
doesn't
the
matter
baseline.
how many trans people will say it.
Yeah.
Nothing we ever say will ever satisfy people. No amount of science we ever put together will ever prove it. It will never meet. So it's why should we engage? Why should we entertain a conversation as if science has some proof that's out there when any study that we produce will never be accepted? That's not the root of the problem, right? I agree I have concerns too about how young people access care. I don't have concerns about people getting puberty blockers on a first visit. I don't agree with this idea that, why are we not attacking puberty blockers for precocious puberty? Why are we not saying that these medications are completely should never be used? That's not what's being said. What's being said is these should not be used for trans people. We don't agree with trans people existing, so therefore we're going to cut off your access to care. We're going to attack young people because they know it's the hardest for us to defend, because they know that it sounds like we're trying to recruit young people. I mean, it's the playbook out of the 80s with gays recruiting kids, the pedophile accusation that used to be laid on LGBT teachers. It's the same type of scare tactic. And I'm deeply concerned about trans young people, but what I'm concerned about is what it means to have your future foreclosed upon, to have no possibility in front of you. I know what that's like. I was that 12-year-old. I know what that feeling is like. It is desperation. It is the idea of I don't want to live another day. If I can't be who I need to be in the world, if I can never access this care because a bunch of people don't understand my spirituality, my belief system, my lived experience. And so I disagree with these conclusions okay, great, the CAS study, I view them as political hit pieces. they reaffirm a bias of the majority. They cherry pick. They exclude any data that would support allowing continued access. And they apply a double standard of like, when we first discovered that SSRIs led to suicidality for young people, if we just said, never again shall we ever allow prescribing SSRIs for young people, where would we be? There are other classes of antidepressants, there's other ways that people can get, therapy treats depression as well. But we didn't do that, did we? And it's because we didn't decide that the outcome was a bad outcome. And so it starts from a premise of like being a trans person is not a good outcome. And from there, the justification of like, we reject all science that supports this intervention. And it's really disheartening to like see all of the progress that trans people have made be eroded by a backlash that is rooted in mysticism and fear-mongering that is not science-based. And just because there are some people in the scientific community that express concern, that's very different than banning. It's just like sports. It's like a ban to take everything away from a group of people. That when is that applied in other instances? When is there other innovation in other medicine that has been completely banned? I can't name a statewide ban of another medication. Can you? That's been happening recently?
Mifepristone, but
okay,
yeah.
Yes, exactly. That's true. Yeah. Yeah. Right. But it's the same thing.
Right.
Right.
I think my concern is because I'm not a spiritual person. I am like a science secularist. I don't know what the word is. I don't like the word atheist.
I am too.
I'm agnostic. But my worry is that we do need to know when you prescribe a medication, like what the outcomes are eventually for people. And I'm completely hearing you that the baseline expectation is that the trans outcome for many audiences and many people looking at this, that being trans is a bad outcome and that should be avoided at all costs. That is not a baseline from which to, evaluate any kind of research fairly. My worry is that when you read into this stuff as an observer, it feels like people use any set of data now for their entrenched position. And I understand that, like, when I say entrenched position, that for you is like my identity and who I am. And I don't mean to belittle that at all. But it feels like, are we ever going to be able to have a non-political review of scientific outcomes again? Because as you say, was it HHS?
Yeah, HHS.
HHS put out a really biased report recently. Anybody basically who releases anything right now has to be scrutinized for their political motivations. Mm-hmm. But like ultimately, these are medications and health outcomes for young people. Like, will it ever be possible, do you think, to actually have like an open-minded review of what is the best set of outcomes for somebody who, and in my mind, that is, we don't want young kids to kill themselves and we want, their happiness to improve.
Yeah.
For me, it's not whether you're trans or not at the end of the road. Is this the best set of outcomes or the best set of treatments? And I'm really worried we're never going to be able to have those conversations because primarily attacks are being made on the trans community, and therefore the trans community has had to kind of bunker down.
I don't agree with that. I think I'll push back a little bit.
Yeah. Please.
And I think I want the same thing, right? Which is like, I want an unbiased evaluation of the data just as much as anybody else does. Like when I was like one of the first people in the United States to get access to puberty blockers. Norman Spack at Boston Children's Hospital was my provider. I was like one of the very first. Like, again, I'm the oldest vampire, and I know that.
How old were you?
I was 15, 14, mm-hmm. 14, 15. I was like not a baby, but like in my mind, it's like, that's baby. And the disbelief of everybody around me, the fear, the concern, rightfully, people were very concerned, right? I, for my whole life, have known truer and deeper than anybody could ever convince me otherwise what my truth was. And what I want is like, yes, I do think we will get to a place where we can evaluate the data scientifically. I think that has happened and that there have been well-designed studies. I think that people don't want to accept the conclusions of those studies. And, you know, when I look at other medicine, like I guess as a bone marrow transplant recipient, what I want the most is like I want parents to have the information they need to make an informed decision, right? I want doctors to have that information too. I want young people to understand the risks and benefits of, you know, some young people might decide, I don't want to take puberty blockers. I'm going to wait till I'm 16, 17 and then go on cross-sex hormone therapy and just like wait. And I might do that. And I think there are young people that do that. And those stories are not elevated, right? We have this vision of like everybody gets forced onto puberty blockers and then everybody gets cross-sex hormones. I just don't think that's real. I've not seen that experience in the trans community. I think people ebb and flow. I think people's access to care changes with their insurance, if their parents move, if their parents change jobs, if they have a really stressful period of time, they might not have access to care. So it's like this idea that it's like there's a monolithic path that everybody is following, is being prescribed. Trans people are sex-changing children. It's just, that is like, is that real in people's lives? Like, can anybody say that even if you've had a chronic condition, you've always had the same access to care your whole life of having that chronic condition? No, it's just not real, right? So I want that data for people too, but I don't ever think that it will not be politicized.
You think it's never going to be enough, basically?
It never will. Even if we had a perfectly designed, double-blind controlled study of thousands of young people, I don't think that it would convince people otherwise. I just don't think that study could be designed ethically, and I don't think it would ever disprove. So I think it's about focusing on what we can control and educating people so that they can make the best decision that they can. And especially parents, like I would never deign to decide for anybody else what care is best. And I would never even tell young people that puberty blockers are going to be great. There are significant downsides for precocious puberty or for trans young people. I don't think, and just like hormones, right? I can't take estrogen anymore. I have a very rare genetic liver condition, which I didn't know about until I was older. It gets worse with age. That's okay. And it's like, I can't take cross-sex hormones anymore, but it doesn't, it's like, that doesn't mean that it's not the right step for other people, right? It's really, you know, my liver can't process estrogen, but, you know, I think it's like a very case-by-case basis, and I want that data, but what I don't want is to have that data weaponized against trans people. And that's what's happened. And I don't think the legislatures or the Supreme Court didn't evaluate the data. They really didn't. I don't think anybody who looked at the data would be like, all of these medical associations, all of these doctors, like what they looked at was like, should states have the right to just ban types of care? And like the Supreme Court decision, Scrimetti didn't really evaluate, does this care have a meaningful outcome? They're like, well, we're judges, that's not our job to decide. The legislature should debate that. Well, the legislatures are not debating that.
That's not going to happen.
What they're debating is like, should trans people exist or not? And they're saying they shouldn't. So that's, I think, the difficulty here is like, I think when things like Scrimetti happen or the Cass review, I think I view it in the entirety of like, there is not a fair trial here. There's not a fair trial. Trans people are not given. It's like David versus Goliath, right? But we don't even have a slingshot. Like, it's not, there will never be a fair amount. And so trans people have no hope to defend our existence other than to say, we know what is true for us. And we also know that when people don't have access to care, HIV rates go up. Young people take more risks. Young people die by suicide. Like, when young people are pushed out of our society and denied and told to deny their existence, it leads to horrible life chances and health outcomes and job outcomes for those young people. And we've all seen it and lived it firsthand, our friends, our family. And so I think that that's the thing that I think a lot about is like, what does it mean to deny care to people? You're basically, you're sentencing them to a life of just, like a much harder, much worse life. And you're not going to change the fact that they're trans. It's just not going to go away.
That's Danni Askini, Seattle-based executive director of the Gender Justice League. A quick note off mic, Askini brought up a study commissioned by the Utah legislature that was released in May. The Salt Lake Tribune reports that, quote, Utah healthcare experts concluded in a more than 1,000-page report, overall, there were positive mental health and psychosocial functioning outcomes. But leadership of Utah's Republican legislative majority have dismissed the findings, and Utah still bans gender-affirming care for trans youth. The Gender Justice League is involved in a number of lawsuits challenging Trump administration policies, including serving as a plaintiff in Schilling versus Trump, which challenges the ban on trans service members in the military. That ban was reinstated by the Supreme Court in May. I wanted to get a sense from Danni of where things stand now for trans military members.
Yeah, so people are actively being discharged. Trans service members, some of whom have served 17, 18 years in the military, are being discharged right now. You know, not because anything that they've done in their service has changed, but because of this ban. We are currently in the appeals court on, related to the injunction, but the Supreme Court allowed a stay of the injunction to go into place, meaning discharges are happening. And so it's going to be a process. Each branch will have their own process of discovering who is trans and how they're trans, but there are going to be witch hunts that will happen, much like Don't Ask, Don't Tell, where people will turn in other people for being trans. We're watching very closely to see if the military violates HIPAA, if they invade people's medical privacy to try and identify who's trans and who's not. But I think our estimate in Washington State is about 1,100 trans service members. Like, a lot of trans service members have come to Washington State, transferred here because of our progressive laws and our large trans community. And we're really...
I've heard anecdotally from doctors at the VA that there's a very large trans veterans community here, and that indicates a very large active duty trans community. Yeah,
absolutely. And so, we're really worried about helping those people get jobs. People, I really, I think what I hear and what I fear is like those people are losing their healthcare, their housing, their job all overnight. And in a way that is not, they're being transitioned out much quicker than usually would happen. Usually, like, people have this program called, or like in the Army, Soldier for Life Transition Assistance Program, or there's a transition assistance program. People are kind of being forced through that very quickly, like in a week, rather than 3 or 4 months.
So they don't have the chance to start looking at their next stage, have an off-ramp that helps them build skills for the regular world, the non-military world.
Yep. People are also being given a code in their discharge where they're not going to be allowed to have a security clearance after, which is a very adversarial step that the administration, it's like pouring salt in the wound of, it is an administrative discharge. It's not a dishonorable discharge, but even with the administrative discharge, they're taking away their ability to maintain a security clearance. I mean, it's spiteful. And these are people who sacrifice. It gets me choked up of all these things. These are people who have sacrificed so much for our country, many of whom are combat veterans. And it's really shameful to be seeing. And I think all of these other conversations for me happen with this background of all of these different attacks against trans people at every level, like erase us from every part of public life, take away our ability to serve honorably, right? You're not allowed to have honor. Take away our ability.
And call it a meritocracy.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's been
very
a lot.
Dehumanizing.
It is very dehumanizing. And so that's what I worry about the most is just how do we care for those veterans when they come home to Washington State? How do we help them transition into jobs? Like, are we being thoughtful about doing specific outreach? We've been in touch with the state VA department, with King County, who've been wonderful and really helpful for us. But we're doing a lot of work to try and think about that and support people as they come home, and to thank them because they have served our country and have done so selflessly.
I want to thank Danni Askini of the Gender Justice League for joining me in studio. And I do imagine that people have a lot of feedback about my conversation with Danni today. Please leave a voicemail for us at 206-221-3213. 206-221-3213 is that number to share your feedback, or you can email us at soundside@kuow.org. And thanks for listening to Soundside.